Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., where we are talking to the man, the myth, and the legend, the head of the military program here, Dakota Wood. Dakota, thanks for taking some time with us.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks for me being with you.
That's right. Thank you for welcoming me into your home. You're obviously one of the key architects of President Trump's plan. He adopted the Heritage Plan. You were one of the key architects of that. And there have also been a little bit of misunderstanding about budget figures and other stuff about that, right? There's this sort of perception the $640 billion is sort of the Heritage Plan. Talk to us a little bit about what the foundations of your plan was and what your rationale was for increases that large. As some people look at it, they say, wow, that's sort of the high watermark. How did you arrive at those figures?
Well, clearly it's an annual debate, right? How much to spend on defense. So what we try to do is take a historical look of how much military capability the United States has needed since the end of World War II. So Korea and Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraqi freedom, these big chunks of combat power. Realizing you also need a rotational base to sustain forward-based operations in many parts of the world. So historically, the U.S. Army, for example, has used about 21 brigade or brigade equivalents of military power. So if you want a two-war capacity force to be able to handle one conflict and still be able to deter opportunism someplace else in the world, you double that, that's 42 brigades. We added a little bit of a buffer, came up to 50 brigades in the active Army. So again, it's a surrogate for land forces. That 50 brigade force sizing metric is historically rooted, and it would be affordable if you looked at percentage of GDP or percentage of the federal budget the U.S. has spent for the last 30 or 40 years.
So as you look at what your ideal budget figure is, even though you didn't work the math, and you were very, very elegant in saying, we're talking about the combat power, right? So the Army, you're basically telling the Army, make the trades necessary to make that happen, for example, in the back shop. Tell us a little bit about what the ideal budget number is, because in this environment, there are those who are looking at this and saying, in this kind of budgetary environment, what the debt picture is. We're dealing with healthcare reform. There are a lot of unknowns about tax reform and how that's going to play out.
Infrastructure development, everything else, right?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we did was we said, well, how important is national security to you? So the federal government can decide to get involved in all sorts of things. You can subsidize agricultural industry. You can spend money on roads and bridges, which are clearly important. You can subsidize health care. There are lots of things that can be done, but we believe that the central purpose of the federal government, one of those one or two key things, is defense of the country. So again, if we look at historical norms as a percentage of GDP, it's been about 5.5%, closing on 6%. So if we have an $18 trillion economy, by historical norms again, you'd be talking a baseline budget of $900 billion. Now, do we have to spend $900 billion? We're not saying that at all. What we're saying is it's feasible. The U.S. has done it in the past when national security and defense matters were important enough. So it's a prioritization of where you want to spend taxpayer monies and the arguments you make for those kinds of things. So we think that the current proposal at $603 billion that's just been forwarded by the Trump administration is a great step in the right direction. The Senate and the House have both proposed like $640 billion. So clearly they see readiness challenges, modernization, expanding the capacity of the military is a very important thing. I personally think, a personal belief is that it needs to be 700, approaching 750. Again, those would all be completely within historic norms going back for almost the last half century. It's just a matter of priorities.
But if you look at it, if you have 640 and you combine that with a $60 billion OCO, you're in that ballpark.
Well, we're arguing that a lot of that OCO money, which should be in the base, should be shifted to the base, right? That the budget caps imposed by the Budget Control Act 2011 have prevented the military from really requesting the funds needed to establish the baseline force, right? So any additional things like going to war, when we did go to Vietnam or Korea or other places, those were additional expenditures in munitions and lost equipment and the pay for mobilizing reserve forces and National Guard and those kinds of things. Those should be extra. But it's clearly the case based on readiness reporting from the services and looking at how equipment is being used up and the planned lifespan dramatically shortened by constant use over the last 15 years, that the baseline budget needs to be dramatically higher than what it is.
But if you look at it and you talk to almost everybody in this town, whether they're on the right or the left, tell you this is going to be a lot like the Reagan buildup. You and I remember that.
Oh, sure.
It was 3 very, very sharp years and then a relative decline, right? That we went into sort of a coasting mode. How sustained would your plan be? How sustained should it be? And how sustained do you think it will be, given the current political reality?
Well, the think it will be is anyone's guess. I mean, as you had already said, we're currently debating it within the country on health care, tax reform, infrastructure development, building walls, lots of things that are competing for limited resources. You asked, how do you pay down the national debt? How do you reduce the annual deficit? We're spending almost $500 billion every year more than what we take in taxes. Nobody wants to raise the tax rate. So we completely understand all those competing priorities. All I'm saying is from a national security standpoint and what it takes to field forces and sustain them over time, it takes a lot more. If you remember back in 2012, the Army had to grow to 45 brigades in the active component just to sustain operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. 45 just to sustain it. They're now down to 32. So, our estimates, based on historical usage of 50 in the active component is right about there from current experience just a few years ago. So, these are not fanciful notions or some fiction that we're developing. This is real-world experience and what it takes for the United States to defend its security interests. If it chooses not to spend the money on the military, then it has to accept a lesser role in the world. And my fear is, unless we change course, we'll be a hemispheric power instead of a global power.
The ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith, was at the McAleese conference. He and Mac Thornberry both are seen as very thoughtful, either sides of the ideological spectrum, but both thoughtful guys on national security. And one of the points that Mr. Smith made was, I'd much rather have an army at 400,000 that's trained, ready, and equipped, rather than a force that's 600,000 people and held together by duct tape. I believe that was his exact quote.
That's a great example.
It's a great quote. He also said that members of Congress, when they get their pins and get elected, don't get magic wands, that you have to make trade-offs. And so I want to get you to a little bit on those trade-offs. Each of the military, well, with the exception of the Navy, the Army is looking for a significant end strength increase. The Marine Corps is looking at not just 190, but perhaps 210, which will be, obviously a large cost component given their relatively smaller budget. Navy wants to hold firm for the time being, but obviously if it gets a lot more ships, it's going to need more sailors. The Air Force is looking for more people as well. And there are some 3 and 4 stars who've told me there's a problem. He said, because they've told me that by the time we recruit, we may end up ramping down, and we may end up shortchanging acquisition. As you look at this, where would you prioritize it? Is it in the people, and do you accept the notion that a smaller force that has all of these aspects is more important than something that's just predicated on size if you have to make the trade-off?
I agree with Secretary Mattis in that readiness of the force that we have is absolute paramount. If you have a small force, small relative to global commitments, it has to be ready for combat. There's just no question about that. So I think his FY17 amendment is focused not exclusively but primarily on current readiness, and certainly the FY18 budget is along the same lines. Next, I would do that for a very small investment relative to what the return would be is expansion of our experimentation. That's a hedge against the future, and it's trying to figure out what all these new technologies mean. Then modernize the force and then expansion of the force. So I think it's important to keep in mind that, brigade combat teams, tactical fighter squadrons, cruisers and destroyers have enduring value, is still critically important. So all the new things coming along, like unmanned systems, how do you do big data mining and artificial intelligence, new communications capabilities, those are additive. They make more effective what you're trying to do when your opponents are also adding those new technologies, right? So you have to have the baseline force, and then how do you account for all these new things? Additional expansions and special operations, cyber capabilities, all these things are important. I know that General Neller in the Marine Corps has said, look, I need to grow cyber warriors and a lot of other things before I start building additional battalions, and I agree with him on that. So, when we add new things, and the old stuff, the legacy equipment, still has enduring value on a modern battlefield. Look what Russia's doing with MLRS and artillery, et cetera, in Ukraine. It just calls for a bigger budget. And it's not warmongering. It's, people forget that in the Budget Control Act, it was an arbitrary cut of $1 trillion over 10 years that was supposed to be so painful that nobody would go that route. But here we are.
Well, and Mick Mulvaney, one of the people who precipitated that, is our budget director, alas. But let me take it to the question of, if you do have 3 years of money, and Dakota Wood is the Secretary of Defense of all the United States, distinguished former Marine, and is the one who's making these calls, where would you prioritize the spending over the next 3 years? If you're going to get a sharp punch of money, where would you put that as a real strategist?
I would clear backlogs in our depot level maintenance. I would get repair parts, component spares, and getting the maintainers necessary to get equipment that's not usable back into inventory. I would expand what are currently at minimum sustained rates into production for munitions and those sorts of things. Factories have been kept alive just enough to keep the lights on and the workforce employed, so they've got a lot of capacity to expand production for not much more of an input. So global sourcing of munitions these days with precision-guided munitions, et cetera, have really become worrisome to the combatant commanders, so expanding those inventories. So again, getting broken equipment back up to speed so that it actually lessens the wear and tear on the force. And it also allows you capacity to do training. So a lot of our training has gone by the wayside for the force as a whole, in order to make sure that what limited funds you have can train currently deploying units so that they're combat effective in zone, right? But across the force, training rates, readiness rates are at absolute lows. And I think that would take care of a good 2 years of additional funding right there.
I know your time is short, but let me ask you one more question. The defense increase that the administration is proposing, the $54 billion, is coming at the expense, for example, of foreign aid funding. There's Homeland Security also goes up, but other departments also get cut. Coast Guard is taking a little bit of a haircut as well. What do you see as the value of foreign investment? Almost every, there were 120 or more flag officers and general officers who wrote the note saying, hey, look, don't cut the foreign aid budget. That serves a very, very important purpose. Let me get your take on that. How important is that for this administration, whether it was the Bush administration or going on back, to have a much more integrated view of it, that it's not just the hard power side of it. That's very important, and it undergirds it. How important to you is also that sustained investment in development and aid that have been a hallmark of U.S. power worldwide?
Well, certainly you want to have more people on your team than on the other guy's team. We have extraordinary interest in access to markets, either to sell our goods or to get the raw materials to produce goods to things. So those kinds of relationships are absolutely important to the health and welfare of the globe, which directly contributes to the United States' economic viability, opportunities for our citizens, and all those things. So these are career professionals in the military that have been studying warfare and the relationships between countries for a long, long time, and they appreciate the value of assisting other countries to get better and to be able to contribute to collective security sorts of interests, right? So if you can prevent wars, if you can mitigate the duration or the severity of a war, that's good for everyone. But then we have to pull back a bit and say what resources are available. If the Trump administration is really set on stemming the rise of national debt, of getting a grip on the growing federal budget on a year-to-year basis, and you have all these competing priorities, it seems that they are prioritizing interests for the country and trying to assess where is the greatest risk. So if I have great risk in the U.S. military in terms of its depths of readiness we just talked about, its ability and capacity to sustain operations in various areas, they want to address that risk first, perhaps at the expense of some moderate risk and us not helping out, another country that really should be doing, more. The 2% line for GDP in NATO member countries has been talked about a lot, but of 28 members, only 25 are at 2% or better, and a few of those, it's only by virtue of increasing salaries, which really isn't deployable combat power. So I think the priorities are right, and we're just faced with the consequences of several years of misplaced priorities and the federal government spending money on things that it really shouldn't be spending money on.
How important are alliance relationships? There is concern about the president's comments, the America First rhetoric. John McCain and Lindsey Graham have both spoken eloquently about it, but it's been a little bit of a bipartisan concern, and even if you go up on the Hill, there are folks who express concerns. You go into the Pentagon, there are folks who express concerns. And the essential message is, the more popular we are around the world, the more people are willing to help us, because one of the big things that we have as the United States isn't just the military power, but the alliances and friendships around the world. How important is the rhetoric that comes out of the administration in preserving those
I
relationships?
think the administration is just drawing some realistic lines. That you don't need to be popular everywhere. You need to be respected. You need to be admired. You need to be appreciated for what you're actually bringing to the game. So to the extent that we're subsidizing bad decisions by other countries, that's not in our interest. If a lot of European countries have decided to subsidize their populations with short work weeks and, extended vacation time and nationalized healthcare systems, those sorts of things, they have made decisions to prioritize that over their own national security interests. And then somehow the United States comes off as a bad guy that says, wait a minute, you all should be acting responsibly as well. So I don't think it's being, evil or malicious or hard-hearted to talk about the realities of what countries should be doing. And, it's much like, we like to help those who help themselves, right? We're not in the business of solving other people's problems, but we are more than willing to engage in collaborative efforts to work together, for a common good, right? So if we want stability and peace around the world, it has to be more than just the U.S. that does that. And I think, as the President has said, we've got a lot of issues here at home. That's not isolationist. It's not with disengaging from the world, but it's really drawing a marker and reflecting what a lot of people have talked about, in our business, that says that, friends and allies need to be doing a lot more than what they have been doing. And I'll go back to, the spending issue there with NATO members. So I think he's just being realistic and saying, we're there for you. We want to help out. We've got forces deployed into regions to, beat back authoritarian regimes and terrorism, but we can't do it all ourselves, and we're just calling upon friends and allies to do more.
But in the course of doing that, if countries don't want to help us, is there a risk in pushing that case that they will not be there when we may need them, because they may conclude, well, you're treating me roughly, and then my response is, I don't want to help you.
Why not? Because if problems arise in their region, they're going to have an oh my gosh moment, and they will have to step up. But it'll be uglier. It'll be higher casualty. The risk goes up. We do have interest in maintaining some kind of stability in various regions, because we sell our goods and services and engage in trade all over the world. So when you have something that's destabilizing in a region, ultimately it hurts us economically. It hurts the number of countries that share various values and principles and those kinds of things. So if some evil arises, if Russia decides to push further into Europe, if China decides to continue its island building campaign, if Iran gets more aggressive in supporting terrorism and destabilizing that region of the world, people will wake up. And what we're saying, I think, as the United States, and especially this administration, is you need to wake up sooner rather than in the midst of a crisis.
Sir, thanks very much for your time. Always enjoy talking to you, and hope to keep talking to you as we go through this debate.
Yeah, it's good to have you over here as well, and we'll talk again soon.